after World War I, there was a big upheaval, and we're still dealing with it now in various areas, particularly in the Middle East, because of decisions that were made by the winning powers after World War I. Austria, who had been an empire, was split up into all kinds of small states that really did not get along amongst themselves. And also they had to pay reparation payments that were dictated by the Allies, and they printed money. So what happened, they just figured, that's one way of doing it, we'll just print it. So anyhow, so this left the whole country with a terrible inflation, and the administration, they didn't know how to deal with it. It had been a monarchy, and they didn't know how to run a country. So Hitler, who was a very strong person, took advantage of all this and started to really agitate in Germany. But in Austria, there were a lot of sympathizers with Hitler or with his approach to the history. With it came an intensification of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism had always existed. I mean, this was nothing new. There were pogroms in Poland or in Russia, and there were expulsions in Spain and other countries. The cause was always a sort of economic disbalance. And whenever there was such a thing, the Jews got the blame. And so there started to be laws passed against employment of Jews. My father, who was Jewish, my mother was not, lost his job because he was no longer, the firm was told not to employ Jews anymore. He had always brought some people to our house, young men that were there for discussing. Austria has many parties, so I mean, it's not like here 2 parties. There were 6 or 7. And they came to our house and they discussed it over dinner. And in 1938, one of the guys came and showed up in the Hitler uniform. At that time, there were 2 types of uniforms for the German, the followers of Hitler. One was brown shirts, and one was the SS, which was all in black. The brown shirts, interestingly enough, were very much discriminated against later in Hitler's reign, and were practically killed to one man, okay? So anyhow, so this guy came to our house in his uniform, and he said, you know, Joe, he said, you better get out of Austria because I've been hearing some terrible things amongst the people that are in the Hitler Party. So my father had a cousin in the United States, so he contacted him. He himself really thought this was never going to happen, but he figured, okay. And then something absolutely horrible happened. His older brother, who had some wartime, his injury from World War I, was sort of agitating against the new regime, and he got arrested and was shipped off to a concentration camp. We never heard from him again. That was that, okay? And the guy that had told my father said, see, you know, you better make a move here. And he happened to be, the cousin happened to be willing to sponsor him. In those days, the United States had a very, very restrictive immigration policy, and it was based on the percentage of the people that were already in this country. Let's say that 20% of the population in the United States was of Italian extraction. 20% of the visas would be issued to people that wanted to come in from Italy. Okay. Austria had a non-existent quota because of the size. In those days, there was a system where if you found a sponsor in the United States and he was willing to take responsibility for you and put money into the bank, actually, in an account that he couldn't touch, to make sure that if that person that he sponsored was not able to make a living, that money was there to support him until arrangements. Things have really changed. Yeah. I don't know whether for the better or not, but it's changed. So this cousin was willing to do this for my father, and my father finally got his papers and left in 1939. Now, one of the things that was very disruptive to our family was that they had to get, my father and my mother had to get a legal divorce, because at that time Hitler had expanded the race laws, and he actually would not allow even the wives, the non-Jewish wives of Jews, to be employed, or anybody from that family. So, you know, there was no way to earn a living unless you somehow got a separation. And Hitler was still trying to cover his things, so he requested in a way that they make false claims that he was not nice to her, that he hurt her, etc., etc. But they did get the divorce, and my father left. About two months after that, in the very beginning of 1940, I was told I could no longer go to school. And they sent me they sent me to the labor department, and they told me there was a place that I would work from now on, and it was actually she was a millinery person. She made hats for very nice people in the center city, but she also had, because of the ongoing upheaval in the labor market, she had to take in army uniforms to be made. So there was a little bitty room in the back of that store, and in it was 2 sewing machines, and that's where she had some people that were like me, that were, told to be laborers. And they were machines that had treadles, foot treadles. They were not electric, and they had they were not made for that kind of heavy material that the army uniforms are made out of. So I wasn't working on that for more than 3 weeks when a needle broke in the machine and went through my thumb. And they were able to clip it and bring it out, but the wound got infected, and my hands swelled up and I couldn't work anymore, so they told me, go home, be my guest.
How old were you when this was happening?
I was at that time 14.
14, okay. And how long was that after your father had left?
Well, about a year, not quite. Okay. It was pretty soon after that. So I was not eligible for 2 things. I was not eligible for ration cards when I wasn't working, and also I was not eligible for medical care. And on the other hand, they didn't have any antibiotics in those days. Penicillin came out, but it was very, very restricted. So my mother knew an old lady and lived in the same apartment house, and she was almost considered a witch. Yeah. She was making all kinds of secret brews for people. And she came and she put some water on to boil on the gas stove, and then she put some herbs into it, and when it was boiling, she took my hand and stuck it in. It was not pleasant, and she did that for 3 more days, and the nail fell off a little bit later, but the thing, arrested the infection, so it was okay in that respect. So of course I hadn't been getting any food in those days when I wasn't working, so I immediately went back to the labor department, and the minute I got there, they took me and they put me in one of those vehicles that they had in those days, and they took me to a Siemens factory on the outskirts of Vienna, and that's where I spent the next 3 years. In those days, many of the small manufacturers, when I say small, Siemens is not exactly small, but small, had labor camps attached to them. They relied heavily on indentured labor because the men were all in the army. Right. So there wasn't that much of a the workers were not available. Right. So they tried to impress anybody they could, and it was a very funny group of people. There were a couple of French prisoners of war. There were a couple of people from Czechoslovakia that had been caught because they were in the underground, and there were a couple of nuns, of all things, that had sheltered Jewish families in wherever they lived, and were caught and were brought there. And then they also had a thing against certain undesirables, me of course included, but also prostitutes and homosexuals, and each one of them had a different kind of insignia. The Jews had a yellow star. I had a yellow M for mixed. Okay. And some other things were for the other people. I can't really remember right now. We lived in a warehouse that had been converted into barracks, and all they did is put a big wall of wooden logs up in the middle that divided men from women, and put in some bunks. There was a toilet in the corner, and that was it. And every morning we were marched out, and we were inspected. And if you were found ready to work, it was okay. If not, you disappeared. The whole thing was surrounded by a very tall fence with barbed wire on top, and it was guarded by German soldiers. The work itself was fairly difficult because they were working on the containers for the electronic controls for the V-2 rockets that were made by Siemens in those days. And it was this machine that was 3 stories tall. On the bottom was like a metal form of some sort that you put a plate on, aluminum plate on it, and then there was this heavy, heavy piston that you raised with a rope that went over a pulley. And when it was 20 feet up, you pushed a button and it fell down, and by the impact made a cup out of that. It was incredibly noisy, and it was also dangerous because that created a lot of heat. And we had a quota. We had to make so many an hour. So you weren't really able to, you had to grab it any way you could fast. So there were a great deal of injuries. But if you were handy, you could survive. Food was, of course, very restricted. We got a cup of coffee made from ground acorns. If you ever run out of coffee, grate some acorns. It's not good, but it does the same thing. And a hunk of bread, so that was breakfast. And then we were inspected, then we worked for 12 hours, and then we were given a bowl of soup. And it was interesting because Mrs. Goering's wife, had a radio show. And she was talking about nutrition with restricted food supply. And she insisted that the peels of all the kinds of vegetables are the most healthy part. And it was true. I mean, you know, we thought it was horrible, but she was correct in her way. So they gave all the peelings that were made by the cook from the army to our particular food maker there, and some potatoes and whatever, and they boiled that into a sort of a mess, and that's what we got in the evening. And we got a chunk of bread. Now, I will say this, if it had been the bread that is on the American supermarkets, the one in the packages, I don't think we would have survived. But this was the really heavy rye bread, you know, and if you got a healthy chunk of it, you got a lot of nutrition out of it. So I was there for 3 years, as I said, and then one morning, the army, the German guys didn't come to pull us out for inspection, and we didn't know what to do. And there was one woman who decided, well, she's going to go explore, and she found that the barracks were open. Not only were the barracks open, but it was completely deserted, the whole factory, and the gate in the fence was open too, and none of the Germans were there. It turned out that the Russian army was in the outskirts of Vienna, coming in from the east, and the Germans decided they were going to leave, because the factory itself was guarded by army, but it was under the administration of German, civilians, and they just didn't feel like waiting until whatever happened. And I decided I was going to walk home. And there was this one chap that I had made friends with. He was a Frenchman. He said, could he tag along? So I said, why not? So we went all across Vienna, and it was eerie. That's all I can say. I mean, there was nobody on the streets. We walked for 2 days and didn't see a single person. And it was very quiet. We didn't really hear much gunfire or anything like that. So we walked and finally came to the area where I lived and found that it had not been bombed. It was that part of the city was okay.
Where was your mother this whole time while this was happening?
My mother, of course, stayed in the apartment. However, she had, by the time we got there, she wasn't there. And we were told by the concierge that she had gone to the country where she had relatives, and she had just left because she was able to travel. And so we stayed there, and the city was being attacked, but it was never in the hands of one army for any length of time. We never knew who was outside, either the Russians or the Germans, or the Russians or the Germans. And one day, not too long after we got there, maybe 4 or 5 days, there was a tank that came from the Russian lines, and he was actually hit by some sort of mortar, but the tank started to burn. And the Russians got out and fled back to wherever they were, and this thing with leaking oil, burning oil, was standing in front of our house. So we formed a bucket line, and we tried to put it out, and there was a building across the street who was actually, it was a sort of a historically under prohibition of changing. It was an old wooden house that had to stay the same, and it started burning. And eventually the roof fell in, and there was a guy behind me that was an older gentleman, and he had, in those days we didn't have plastic buckets, they were all those tin buckets, right. And he threw it up in the air and just ran, and it so happened to hit this French friend of mine on the head. And it must have hit a little artery or something, because he really started bleeding. So I put my thumb on it, and he crawled on all fours back to the house. It was very interesting, I must say. I haven't had a dull life, I can tell you that.
It doesn't sound like it.
Anyhow, so we couldn't stop the bleeding, you know. And of course there was no medical help anywhere available. And one guy said, "Oh, I have an idea." And he took a little sandbag, because they had put sandbags in front of the front door to, you know, shelter it. And he tied it on his head on top of the bandage. And it applied enough pressure. Yeah, it worked. About a couple of days later, we kept trying to lift it, and it was still bleeding. But it finally stopped, and he was okay.
So you're laughing as you tell me all these stories, but at the time, were you terrified?
No.
I can't even imagine.
No,
I feel like I would have been scared out of my
that's
life.
one thing I was not.
No?
As a matter of fact, there were, of course, bomb runs on Vienna, too. And in the factory, they had built one of those... there are some on the Delaware shores. There are these bunkers that are like about 3 stories tall, and on top is a platform that has like anti-aircraft or guns of some sort. There was one, and it's still there, right next to that factory that was like defending the area around the factory. And it was interesting because they bombed the area quite heavily, but they never hit the factory. They hit everything around it, but not the factory. And we weren't allowed to go to shelters. The other workers were allowed to go to shelters. And we used to sit in the courtyard. It was open, and we used to see the planes around. And we were taking bets, because you can tell from the whistle of a bomb whether it's going to land close to you or not. You learn this very quickly. So nothing ever came close to us, so we were just fine.
Oh, my goodness.
No, I must say I was not scared at all. Not during the whole time. I guess I'm just lucky in that respect. Anyhow, so my mother came back a little bit later, maybe 6 months later, and she was fine too. But the situation, by that time the Russians had taken the city. And there had been some sort of agreement, I understand, between the Allies and the Russians, that the Russians were going to be allowed to take the city and do with it what they want for a while. So they came in, and of course they were rough people. You don't know the kind of persons that come in, because they were actually, a lot of them were like Mongolians, okay. And they were what you would consider the stormtroops. And then once they were pulled out, the other ones that got the occupation were not quite as nasty, but the first ones were really, really bad. And young women particularly, Vienna has mostly apartment houses, and usually there are cellars underneath, and each apartment has like a storage room down there. People used to keep vegetables in them and whatever should be kept cold. And there were benches built around it that had like a lid that would open, and the young women would crawl in there, and the older woman would sit on top, so that if anybody came in, they were confronted by old ladies, which worked in a way. Anyhow, so, but food was completely absent. I mean, nothing was coming into the city. Germans had destroyed a lot of the infrastructure because they didn't want anybody to be able to use it afterwards. So water had to be brought in from God knows where there was some running tap someplace. We had no electricity. And like I said, particularly food was almost impossible to get. The Russians took almost anything that wasn't nailed down and took it back and shipped it off to Russia. There was a little factory not too far from where I lived, and it was making leather belts and beautiful stuff like that. And the Russians took that over. And they sent a notice around saying that if anybody would work for them because they didn't know how to operate the machinery, they would give them food in return for their labor. So, of course, I figured, what else have I got to lose? So I went there, and it was funny because there was an outfit of Russians that were almost autonomous in running this factory. There were 3 men and a woman. The woman wore the same kind of rough clothing that the men wore, and they had a truck that was barely running. But what they did is once a week they would go out into the country, and they would just, what you would call, liberate whatever they could find and bring it in and then distribute it for the people that worked there. Once they brought back a live cow and they shot it in the courtyard. And they said, help yourself. Well, I said the Russians may have known how to divide a cow into pieces, but we didn't know. I mean, we were from the city. So the guys sort of shrugged, oh, you're not good for anything, and took this hatchet and started hacking that cow into pieces. However, I hadn't had any meat, I think, in about 10 years by then, so I didn't care how it was divided up. And then a short while after that, the city was actually divided into 4 sections, and our particular part of the city turned out to be in the American sector. So by that time, the government had decided to run trains out of the city. You didn't have to pay, you just had to show up early in the morning, and if you had anything to trade, that you could possibly obtain something in the country, because the farmers were not that badly off. They still had a lot of their stuff. So there was one morning about, maybe it was very early, it was dark yet, and the train usually left very, very early in the morning, and I was going along in the dark, and I fell into one of the bomb craters that had been exactly where the trolley line was running. And it had made a big hole, and there were some shards of metal sticking up. And I fell on one of them, and it went into my leg. I still have the scar someplace here. And I was bleeding, you know, but I had these heavy-duty pants on, and I couldn't see what was happening. And I decided, well, so what, you know, let's go on. And we did need the food, so I went into the country, and it was very nice because I met an old lady that was living in that country, and she pointed to my leg, and she says, you're bleeding. And I said, yeah. And she said, come, I'll bandage it up for you. And she did, and then she said, what are you doing here? So I told her my sorry story, and I got a big bag of potatoes and a couple of cabbages out of it. It means we had food for a week, so that was just fine. So, a little bit later, there was a guy in our apartment house who had been an amateur magician. And he was doing it only for his family and all that, but he also was very hungry, so he went and he somehow got a deal with some of the American and English clubs that opened to entertain the GIs, and he would perform his magic, you know, and he wanted to have somebody female around to hand him his props, so he hired me, and I had to make up some skimpy kind of costume and parade back and forth with handing him his props on this stage. And he taught me some very, very, very simple tricks to perform. And I said I weighed all of 80 pounds. I must have been a sorry sight, but hey, what can you do? We had lost contact with my father completely. We didn't even know where he lived, but we did know the address of the cousin. So my mother got this idea that because the Postal Service was not working at all yet, and we knew that the Americans, and of course the other forces probably too, had free post postal service. So my mother got this very, very clever idea that all I need to do is go to one of those GIs and tell him to send a letter, for us. Well, she had a little bit idealistic opinions of what young men that are in a uniform would do for people without any returns. And I can't blame them that much. At the time I did, but I can't blame them too much because there were all kinds of young girls in Vienna that were so desperate for food that they thought up all kinds of excuses. I think the guy was probably more surprised than anything to actually get a letter back. He probably thought I was just, trying to make a relationship there. Well, anyhow, it turned out a little bit unpleasant. I will not dwell on this. But he did get a letter, and my father wrote that he had a job, he was working, but he also had remarried. My father and his older brother, the one that died in the concentration camp, when they were in their early 20s, right after World War I, they had courted the same young woman. Now, my grandmother, their mother, had been widowed very young. She was left with two very young children. I think they were 2 and 4, he and his brother. And she had brought them up single-handedly by herself. And she was a very strong woman, and they were at each other's throats. So she went to talk to this lady, the girl that they were courting, and she said, pick one of them and put an end to this, for God's sake. And she says, but I don't want either one of them. I'm having fun here. And my grandmother said, you are not having fun. You're going to stop courting both of them. I don't want to hear one more word out of you. And she did. My father came to the United States, and there were a couple of organizations for new refugees where they got together. And the first party that he attended, who was there but that woman?
Oh, my goodness.
So,
what are the chances of
it's
that?
Very, very odd. And the only reason I know that is because they were married for many years. And when I came to this country, she was living with, of course, with my father. And so I heard her story of it, which was not my mother's story, of course, but that was that. Anyhow, so my mother said, okay, she said, your father is just, this is nothing. This is economic. I'm sure he's just doing this because it's convenient or something. And he had written that I could come to join him as long as I was under 21 as a dependent without the visa problems. So she said, go and visit him and bring him back. So I said, I don't think this is going to work. Yeah, but she kept at me, so I decided, okay. Now, it wasn't just that. It was obviously that the lure of the country. We were living there really, really primitively. And the United States was supposed to be the country where the streets were paved with gold. So I didn't make that much of an objection, and I decided to come. That was early in 1947. Now, 47 was an incredibly hard winter. The harbor in Bremerhaven was frozen solid. Nothing could get in and out. The only way you could get any place, the trains weren't running yet, not connective between countries, was through an organization called UNRRA. It was United Nations Relief and something or other organization. It still exists, but not quite the same initial thing. There's one R that has been dropped. But other than that, it still does the same work with refugees. So my father was able to arrange for me to come with one of those trains. And I left in very early in April 1947. We traveled interestingly enough, in the same cattle cars that they had used to take people to concentration camps. There were no seats. There was one of those big doors that slid open. Right. There was no heat. There was no toilet facilities whatsoever, and almost no food either, because they didn't know how long we were going to be on the road. On the train. As it happened, because of the severe weather, it took us 2 weeks to get from Vienna to Munich. which is not a very big distance. And we were in this thing, and they had given us these big metal jerry cans full of water. And the first time we tried it, they were frozen solid. So we took turns sitting on them to keep the water, from freezing. And when somebody's, what got too cold, they switched over to somebody else who sat on it for a while. We also got these big army ration cans. They were almost like gallon cans that had in it some sort of mixture between ham and eggs. But somebody messed up and didn't give us a can opener. So there we were staring at those cans full of food, and we didn't know how to open them. So finally what happened is one of the guys happened to have a Swiss knife, and he sort of jammed cut the lid off. It took us, like I said, 2 weeks to get to Munich. Once there, Munich did not exist. I mean, Munich was completely flattened. You could walk and walk and walk and find nothing but heaps of bricks and stuff. I mean, there was absolutely no structure left. Vienna had not been bombed that excessively, but Munich had. So we were taken to this. It used to be an old army depot type thing for the German army, of course. They just told us, go in and find a bunk. I mean, they didn't care how we did it or what we did. And the food, somebody must have made a fortune because, I mean, there were people giving money to that organization left and right in the United States. And our food was so bad. And, I mean, even on the trip, most of the people that got there were from Eastern Europe. They had come from concentration camps or from, devastated parts of the country. And they weren't in the best of conditions, so it was not unusual to wake up in the morning and find a couple of people had died during the night. Well, we kept the food that was allocated to them. And it was a different time, but like you said, I was not really scared. I mean, you just did what you had to do, and you were glad because you could do something that was helpful, and nothing bad happened for a day, so that was good, So anyhow, they gave us with each meal, even though the food was very, very bad, they gave us 2 cigarettes with every meal. And very few of us smoked, so they told me, because I spoke German, and Munich, of course, speaks German, they said, find a place, there's a black market, we know there's always a black market, and see what you can get for the cigarettes. So I used to take the cigarettes, and I used to go to the black market and get whatever I got. And it's fascinating that even in a city that is practically on the edge of starvation, there are people that will trade food for cigarettes. So we sometimes got, food. Once we got cheese, once we got apples. So it was fine, it was okay. And then at the end of 3 weeks, there was a train that came through that was aimed for Bremerhaven. And they took us aboard, and we went to Bremerhaven. Now, Bremerhaven was still frozen. No ship could get in and out. So there was a school that had been converted into quarters for immigrants. And we were put there, and the food was better there a little bit, and they had one luxury that hadn't had for years and years and years. It had almost like a gym, and in the dressing room for the gym, there was one of those sinks that was attached to the wall. It was one long metal thing with a spigot every 4 feet or so. And we were told that there was going to be hot water 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour at night. And I had been in the same clothes for weeks at this point. I just went there and I stripped off and I climbed into that trough. And I just sat there until they told me, you've used up your quota of water. And ever since then, I am not at all embarrassed when it comes to nudity. Eventually, late in April, the harbor opened up, and we were told that we were going to board this ship. Now, the ship was an old American freighter that had been converted into a troop transport. And it had what was very interesting. There was a command bridge, but it extended out beyond the ship. It was one floor up, but it was you know. And we were told that the people that felt that they were the healthiest were supposed to go down in the deepest part, which is where you feel the motion of the ship most. Well, the night we got on that ship, we had the first time it was called for food, chow time. And we got there, and they had this magnificent, I still can see it, buffet with mounds of potatoes, mashed potatoes, hamburgers. They had ham, they had vegetables, they had cake, they had this, they had that. And it was wonderful. Yeah. Except that I saw on the table, there was a side table there that had big cans of condensed milk and sugar. Sugar. So I got this. So I got this mug and I filled it up with cream and put the sugar in until it was almost solid, and I ate it with a spoon. Could not eat one bite of food. We left in the morning and hit an absolutely terrific storm on the channel, on the Atlantic, the channel between England and the European coast. And everybody was seasick within 2 hours. And they were so sick that they could not get out of their bunks. Now, the bunks, mind you, were like 15 inches apart. If you got in on your back, that's how you stayed. If you got in on your stomach, that's how you stayed. You couldn't be on your side. That wasn't tall enough for that. And I tell you, what that was like after a few hours of people being seasick was not the greatest. So I took a couple of blankets and I took a pillow that I could take, and I went on deck. And where the bridge went across, there was one corner that was very sheltered. And it was lucky because the stack, you know, the vent from the galley went up there, and it was rather nice and warm there. And I never went back to that bunk in the bottom of the ship. But I also was told afterwards that I was the only one that never missed a meal. And we actually, there were a couple of us that were in good shape, and we used to follow. There was one sort of like it was not a nurse, but it was somebody that was in charge of supplies, and she had some oranges that were scarce, but they were there, and we used to follow her around, and she used to give it to the people, you know, and we used to say, "Do you really feel like eating that?" Yeah. And we scored quite heavily. It took us about 2 weeks, not quite, to cross the ocean. And my father had been calling every day, you know, when is the ship coming? When is the ship coming? And finally they told him, look, we can't tell you anything. We'll call you on the day that the ship is finally coming in. Okay, fine. At that time, we still came in through Ellis Island. We were, I think, the last transport that came in through Ellis Island. Wow. Yeah, it was that late in 47. And we were divided into groups by our name. There was a big sign with the letter on it, and you stood there and we waited for whoever came to pick you up. Well, the day passed and nobody came. And by the time night fell, there were only 3 of us left. And we didn't know what to do. I was petrified. I thought, well, maybe he changed his mind. He decided it was too much trouble anyhow. Forget it, you know. So they turned us over to Travelers Aid. And Travelers Aid got in touch with some people, and they told them that my father had called, so it wasn't that. Apparently what had happened, that was the one night during the week that they wanted to go out to dinner, so they met right after work, went out to dinner, didn't come back until later. And my father at that time lived in New Jersey. Now, New Jersey and Ellis Island are not exactly close, and he didn't have a car, so he had to take public transportation. However, they did reach him eventually, and you know, he said it'll come right in, but it'll take some time. So the guy that was in charge of the particular Travelers Aid office said, okay, I'll take you to a diner to eat. It was on the Bowery. And he took us to this diner, and they had, you know, the menus in a diner are like 6 pages.
Right.
I couldn't read one word. But there was one word that I recognized, and it was liverwurst.
Oh, sweet, okay.
So my first meal, like it says in that thing that I gave you, was a liverwurst sandwich.
All right.
So my father came, and I went home with him. So I found that my father had never really gotten a job that made a lot of money. They were living in a very nice apartment. It overlooked the Hudson, and it was on the Jersey side, and it overlooked the skylight, which is magical. When I got there, they had converted that into a sort of a room for me. It wasn't actually sleeping. I had to sleep on the sofa, but they had put in one of those metal closets and all that. So it had one, for me, magical thing. I had never had a bathroom, and this had a bathroom with a bathtub. But I felt that I actually should really contribute financially immediately. So the only thing I could think of was, because I knew how to run a sewing machine, I got a job in the garment center in New York. A lot of the ladies that worked there were Jewish ladies that didn't speak English. They spoke Yiddish. I hardly understood them, although with German you can make yourself understood a little bit. But they were so frightened of the guy, because he was a very volatile person, that they appointed me, all of 21 years old, forelady they called it, and I was, every time there was a change in design, I had to go in and sit with him and say, listen, it takes us so long to put that sleeve in, and that's how much you have to pay. And he would say, no, da, 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 and so it went on and on. And at night, that was the one thing that we did get. There were free English lessons that we could attend. And my father had said immediately, he said, you get along in English. No, we do not speak German in this house, he said. Anyhow, so I worked there in that particular place for about 2 years, and then I knew enough English to get a job in insurance. There was a group of young people that were the children from immigrants, and I met my husband through one of those groups and got married in 1950. We eventually had 2 children, wound up in buying a house in Levittown, Pennsylvania. Eventually, my husband lost his job when the kids were just about ready for college, so I had to find a way to earn a living, and the only thing I could think of is nursing. I had a friend, and I was doing all kinds of stuff. I was actually cleaning people's houses for extra money and stuff like that. And I had a deal like that with her. She was going to school to get an RN degree. And she got a job with Abington Memorial Hospital, and she said to me, you know, if you can prove that you can stick it out for 6 months in a nursing home, they are hiring at Abington Memorial. That's a story all by itself. I'm not going to go into it. It was very distressing to be in a place like that. But I did get through it, and I did find a job.
Well, I imagine with everything you went through before that,
yeah,
you can get through pretty much anything. Yeah.
Just par for the course. And I worked there for 7.5 years in nursing in Abington Memorial. And then I got a job with a physician. He had an endocrinology lab, and I was running his office. So I did that. Then my husband died very young. We were only 60 when he died. I decided I was going to go to Florida, where all the old people go. And I went to Florida, where all the old people go, and I hated it. Absolutely detested it. I had worked for this physician for a while at that time, and all of a sudden I get a call from him. He says, could you come up here for 6 months? I ran into a terrible situation here. I need you to straighten it out. I'll pay for your hotel. I'll pay for everything. I said, Dr. Schlaf, I said, I'm coming back. Forget about Florida. So I went back, and he had replaced me with a couple of people that were not good people. And the one guy that he finally started to embezzle, and it was a real mess because I had to straighten out between the insurance companies and everything. It took me 2 years to get that straightened out. So during that time, I lived in one of those huge buildings next to the art museum called the Philadelphian on the 15th floor. And then afterwards, I decided I didn't like city living, so I bought a house in Kennett Square. And shortly thereafter, my boss had to close his office because the insurance wouldn't cover that kind of service anymore. So I was in Kennett Square for the next 20 years, and now I'm here. My mother used to come and visit. I brought her over, and she did not like the United States.
Oh, sorry.
You must understand that living in Vienna is entirely different. I mean, the sidewalk cafes and the little restaurant on every corner, and the trams where you can bring your dog. I mean, you know, they actually have tickets for dogs, would you believe it? And you can take your dog all over the any place, you know, to restaurants or whatever it is. The royal family had lived very well, but they had also been very paternalistic. So for every palace ground or whatever they had, they made a park for the people. And you can be in Vienna any place, and you're perfectly safe. There is no crime at all. The inner city, there is practically no automobile traffic because the streets are too narrow. So, you know, it's an entirely different life. And so my mother was not happy here. And also she was, she didn't want to learn a new language. She didn't want to do this. She didn't want to do that. So she stayed in that same apartment until she died. Just to tell you a little bit of my life now, it was also one of those things. A lot of things with me just sort of fell into place. I had a friend who was looking for a retirement home, and she lived in Kennett Square. Now, I will tell you something about what Kennett Square is outside of Wilmington, and there's an awful lot of things to do there. There's all these DuPont places. I was a volunteer at Longwood Gardens for 20 years. And I have a book. I have a book where I was doing translations for the curator of plants, and my name is actually in there. This is a story about the water lily that has those huge leaves. So the volunteer opportunities there were absolutely out of this world. I mean, you know, I hated to leave, but I was living in a ranch house, and I was 87 at that point, and it just wasn't feasible to stay there anymore. So this friend of mine said to me, they're having an open house at one of the retirement communities. Do you want to go? And I said, a retirement community. Well, anyhow, we went, and it was one in Kennett Square. And we walk in there, and they had this big tent that they had, and whatever. There were tables for people sitting there, and they had food. And there was a gentleman that was in a wheelchair, and he was looking for a place to go. And he was sitting all by himself. Everybody was avoiding him. And I said to my friend, I said, let's go and sit with him. Then we started talking, you know. And he said, well, this is not for me, but I have a place in mind. There is a Masonic village here. It's in Lafayette Hills. And I have applied there. I just wanted to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. So we sort of kept in touch with him, and he invited us to go see his new digs at Lafayette Hills. And we went there, and it was an apartment type thing, you know, but they had taken a lot of trouble to make it comfortable. So he said, well, what about it? You two people are looking for a place, come live here. And I said, no, this is not for me. This is much too urban, because Lafayette Hills is in an industrial section and all that. And my friend, the other one, on the other hand, said, nah, I don't want to live here. He said, well, if you people want to live in the sticks, there's a Masonic village in a place called Elizabethtown. Go look at that. And he was making a joke. And she said, do you want to take a look at it? And I said, well, what the hell? It's a nice day for a drive. So we drove out here. And she looked at them, and she decided it was too far away from civilization for her. she was ushering theaters, and she was used to a different type of thing. But I was absolutely enchanted with the nature. I mean, the nature thing here with the cows. I mean, cows in my development. But I wasn't ready to sell my house. So I had a very, very nice house and an acre and a half of grounds, which I must brag about it because I really did a nice job with it. And people would, it was actually on display in the garden tours and all that stuff. But it was getting almost impossible for me to take care, because you can't get help. Anyhow, so I was futzing around with it, and this couple is walking by with 2 dogs. Young couple, and he stops and he says, we are so impressed by what you're doing here. We walk our dogs here all the time because my father lives a couple of blocks away, and we've always looked at your house and we've always wanted a house like that. So I jokingly said, I'm getting older. I mean, one of these days I'll have to sell it. And he said, could we see it? And I said, okay. My house is pretty much picked up all the time. I'm fussy that way. Anyhow, so they looked at the house, and that was the end of it. 3 months later, he calls me, and he said, have you decided whether you're going to sell yet? And I said, well, and that was in the middle of winter. And I had a long driveway, and it was going uphill, and the trash can, and I had taken a couple of spills on it, And I said, well, maybe it's time, and he said, well, we could do it between ourselves. We don't need a realtor. We don't do this, and here is my offer for your house. And it was more than I had expected. So I said, So I went back and I called the administration here, and I said, I know you have a waiting list, but how long do you think I would have to rent to possibly get one of your cottages? And Brenda, at that time it was Brenda, she's retired by now. She said, we have one cottage where a deal just fell through and nobody on the waiting list is interested. If you want it, you can have it. So that's what happened. In 2013, and I've been here since.